My name is Nick Burns. I'm a professor here at the Kennedy School, formerly an American diplomat, very proud to be with my friends from Deutschland. I don't think I need to make formal introductions because three of our panelists have made keynote speeches. But the fourth person has not been introduced, I don't think. And this is someone who is a literal bridge between Germany and the United States because she was born in Germany. She is a German citizen. She was educated there, but her graduate school education has been in the United States, including at Harvard University. She is now the director of the Future Diplomacy Project here at Harvard. This is our project to try to emphasize the role and the necessity of diplomacy, especially by the United States, not just thinking we can get our way through military means, but that we can act in concert with other countries. She's done a magnificent job of arranging this program, creating it, and I've had the great pleasure to work with her. So Catherine Kluver is joining Mr. Butikhofer and Klaus Naumann and Wolfgang Ischinger. Please join me in welcoming all four panelists. So as General Naumann might say, the order of battle for this conference, for this panel, is the following. We're going to have a conversation here. Should I take it? Yeah, it's back. How is that? That's much better. Okay. The order of battle is that we're going to have a conversation here for about 30 to 35 minutes. Following that, we'll have you ask questions of these panelists, and I want to focus on German and American relations, and I want to focus on an issue that Wolfgang mentioned in his remarks, an article by our friend Roger Cohen, who is actually a fellow in our program here at Harvard, will be coming back here in the first week of March, those of you from the Kennedy School. And I was struck by it because in the New York Times yesterday he said we're experiencing the lowest moment in US-German relations, he said, since the Second World War. That's a long time. I wonder if we are at the lowest moment. And Klaus, I thought I'd start with you. Is that, in your judgment, accurate? And what should we do about it if it is?
I didn't get your question acoustically.
The lowest, Roger Cohen said it's the lowest moment in the US-German relationship.
I apologize, I didn't get it acoustically since the microphone is directed in this direction, and a former artillery officer which is used to the sound of a 155 howitzer or an 8-inch howitzer doesn't listen to noises which are much, much lower than that. I think we are really at the moment at a rather low moment in German-American relations. And from my perspective, I should say, I see in my country a lack of trust in the behavior of the United States of America. You educated us after World War II to believe in the rule of law and in the proper control of all instruments of power by a democratically elected government. And at this point in time, many of my compatriots see that obviously instruments are allowed to do what they wish to do according to their capabilities, and that there is a lack of control on the side of the government and of the American Congress. That is a perception of many Germans. And for that reason, I believe the belief in this wonderful shining city on the hill, which represents democracy, the rule of law, the basic idea of our Constitution, that the individual is protected by the rule of law against the power of the own state. This basic belief is violated at the moment. And for that reason, I believe we are really at a low point. And in addition to that, I have to add, we do not see from a European perspective, and you know, Nick, that I'm really one of these NATO war horses which believe in the importance of the transatlantic relationship. We do not see a very keen interest on the side of the United States government in European affairs. Europe is there, but it doesn't matter. And of course, our own attitude contributes to that. But I think we have to overcome it. Otherwise, the drifting apart, which we see geographically anyway, if we look at the big fault in Iceland, this drifting apart could become a reality. And we have to stop it, since, as I said in my talk at the end, if Europe and the United States drift apart, the community of values and convictions will drift apart. And we should never forget, these values and convictions are not shared by the majority of people on this globe. We are a minority, and for that reason we have to stand together. And I think that is the point we need to overcome, and what we need is not exchange of verbal notes, but really much more dialogue. We need to come together more often, and we need not to talk about each other, but we need to talk to each other, as we did it in the, you may forgive me if I say so, in the happy old days of confrontation.
Okay, so General Neumann, my friend Klaus has put two issues on the table. One is the health of the US-Germany relationship. The second is really the Obama administration's policy towards Europe and vice versa. Let's focus on the first. Catherine, if the US-German relationship is at its lowest point in 65 years, is it accurate to say that the United States is 100% responsible for that? Are we responsible for the lack of trust, or is this a two-way street? And what should Berlin and Washington do to repair the relationship?
Well, I do think there is obviously a two-way street component to it, but I think it's worthwhile to look back at 2008 and look back at the president's speech at the Siegessäule in Berlin, because as Ambassador Ischinger pointed out, previous crises were on policy. Even the Libya question was on policy. The United States was disappointed by the abstention of the Germans for the Libya mission, but we moved on. What the recent scandals or recent revelations have brought up are, again, a fundamental, I wrote down an emotional rift. This is an emotional rift in the partnership, and trust is a part of that, because you had a would-be president in 2008 talking about the world standing as one. And finally, the Germans felt that they were, again, part of this discussion. They were going to be taken very seriously by the United States. They were contenders after the "you are either with us or against us" having been pushed out of that sort of trust and functional relationship for obvious and political and important reasons that Germany decided not to partake in the Iraq War. That being said, I think the Germans and the Europeans still suffer from an affliction of symbolic politics. Symbolic politics are incredibly important in the European context. So for over the course of time, EU-US summits to be watered down in numeric value, you have fewer of them. The president decides not to go in some cases. Those are things that the Europeans watch very closely, but I think to your point, watch in some cases passively. And so I have argued in the past, and I think we'll talk about TTIP in a little while, there are some very concrete things that we can be doing. There are some very concrete things that the European side can be, and particularly the German side as well, can be advancing to make some concrete progress here. But fundamentally, and this was very clear at the Munich Security Conference that I attended this year, there is a gap of understanding. The Germans do not feel heard. They do not feel heard in this, literally in this misunderstanding, in this pain. I mean, this is really painful So much so that our former defense minister said in a panel on cyber attacks, how can it be, if this is a functioning partnership and a functioning friendship, that I have to read about everything that's going on in the Spiegel and the New York Times? How are we not picking up the phone to one another? How are we not talking to one another? And I think that's where really the fundamental chasm is.
Thank you very much. And Roderick, let me just ask you to comment on this, and I just pick up from where Catherine and Klaus left us, and that is, and I understand this from my own German students here in my class who tell me that we Americans do not understand the depth of feeling in Germany over the Snowden affair. A cynical American, I'm not a cynical person, I hope, but a cynical person might say, but wait a minute, the United States defended Germany for 6 decades. Does that earn us a little credit in the trust barometer? And we're not the only country in the world that has an intelligence service. Germany has one. Most other countries have one. Is there a little bit of hypocrisy here in European complaints about the United States?
I would say that certainly you can put that before the bracket. There is hypocrisy. I've never seen politics without hypocrisy. So that doesn't really give you an answer, but sure, there is. What I see as an interesting and, well, also worrying new development is that it's not the usual suspects that have a fallout with the United States. It's not the anti-Americans, or, I mean, the people you always expected to criticize whatever any US administration does. It's the true believers. And I think that takes some analysis, and I'm not sure I already understand why that is, but I would argue that to some degree, the transatlantic community in Germany, to talk about my own country, has always strived to be kind of the best pupil in class. The ones who would be as reluctant to criticize the Americans as anybody. And they now get the impression they're making fools of themselves. Like, look at Pofalla, what happened to him. He tried his very best to protect the Obama administration against criticism over NSA. And he was made a complete fool when the truth transpired. Now, that didn't only happen to him. I know a good number of friends of mine from the conservative side of the political spectrum, CDU, CSU, who are really up in arms. And to some degree, there is also a perception that trying to be the best pupil in class is not sufficient anymore. The Siegessäule, the famous falling Germans, that was our last attempt to resuscitate this old attitude. Oh, after all, now Obama is the hero and the savior and whatever. It failed. And in a way, there is a not necessarily conscientiously and analytically understood, but a feeling in the belly that Germany has to move beyond trying to be a good pupil. Germany has to take its own responsibilities. And they're being treated in a way, I mean, talking to the Germans and telling them you should take leadership responsibilities is like, forgive me the military comparison, General, promoting someone who has been a non-commissioned officer to become a lieutenant or a major. But you still deal with him as the non-commissioned officer that he was before. He doesn't like that. That's small surprise. And I think there are very simple, symbolic things that the US could do differently. Obama went to Prague a couple of years ago for a European summit. He was so annoyed with having to meet all those numerous heads of state and government that he told his people never ever again. When Xi Jinping comes to Europe, he makes a point of meeting every single head of state and government from all the Central and Eastern European countries, even though only for 5 minutes, and they are flattered. And he uses that even to pursue splittist policies with regard to the EU, but he goes there and talks to them. Obama is coming to Brussels next month. No idea of going to the European Parliament. I'm not sure he should speak in the full plenary, but he should go there, meet at least the president, meet the heads of the political groups, make a gesture that he is not afraid of talking to his critics. That's very simple. It would change the atmosphere just a little, but it would be helpful.
Thank you very much. I wonder if at this point, do Germans and Europeans miss George W. Bush? Or, I say that I'm a supporter of President Obama. I support him in what he's doing, but I hear complaint after complaint, and let me just maybe ask Wolfgang if you wouldn't mind this question, because you're a longtime observer. Have we pivoted too much towards Asia, and have we forgotten about Europe? Is that fair? Is that a fair criticism?
No, and I don't think that that's really the point. Look, if I may go back just for 1 second to this question, is this the very low point? Well, I think it's a complicated situation. Angela Merkel and Barack Obama both agreed to take the initiative for TTIP. They were the leaders. This is a great project. Some people say this is a historic project. We agree on many, we happen to agree today on many concrete issues of foreign policy. We support John Kerry's efforts on the Middle East. We were not happy that President Obama didn't find a better way to deal with the Syrian crisis, but who are we to criticize him for not intervening? Again, we are absolutely now, and certainly more than was the case 5 or 10 years ago, on the same page regarding Iran. So, you know, it's not true that we disagree on all the fronts. In fact, you could argue on most concrete issues, we agree. We even agree that Putin has not behaved well. And that it's a shame what has happened in and over Ukraine. You know, the problem is that this is Catherine made the point. It's a trust issue. It's not a policy issue, and I understand that it is very difficult for President Obama to do what some people have suggested when they said, why doesn't he just simply offer an outright apology? Well, if he offers an outright apology to Chancellor Merkel, his advisors will probably tell him, you need to apologize to 200 other people too. So that's probably a hard thing to do. And it's not, I find it very difficult if I put myself in the role of somebody at the White House who tries to figure out a way forward. I understand this is not easy, and there are great difficulties. But I believe, as was just said, the White House could easily figure out ways to tell Europeans that they respect Europe. The European Parliament is one way how that could be shown. I'm sure there are many other ways. And that is the lingering suspicion that this administration is, as Roger Cohen put it, not really listening but instead listening in. Not listening to us, but listening in to us. And that means disrespect, and that hurts. That hurts, especially if you are in a situation like Angela Merkel, that a couple of years ago you were invited to the Rose Garden and you got the Medal of Freedom, etc. And you know, it's not difficult for her political opponents at home to, you know, to smile and say, "Oh, this is your friend." You know, he was actually listening to your cell phone. That's the kind of friendship you enjoy? So
Mild.
you've been very mild about it. But in other words, for her, this is really a humiliating experience. It is personally humiliating, and that's what makes this so different from a classic, you know, policy conflict issue.
Okay, so let's pick up there and talk about how do we revive the relationship. Some people might say that the United States, over the last 10 to 15 years, has drifted away, not so much from Germany, but from Europe because of the inaction of Europe. Because our dynamic partners have been Japan and Australia and the Saudis and the Turks in the major challenges that we've undertaken. Your president gave a very courageous speech at the München Security Conference. It made all the headlines. So I'd like to ask all of you, are we looking at a stronger Germany now? Will this new Germany have a higher defense budget, a stronger military? Will it vote for Security Council resolutions to depose dictators in countries like Libya in the future? Will it be the kind of stronger Germany that Americans have long wanted to see on the world stage? Because I think trust and respect are sometimes earned by actions. I understand it's a two-way street, that Washington needs to make up the trust deficit with Berlin. I get that. And the president will have an opportunity when he's in Europe. And I think you've given us some good suggestions as to what he might do to make up the trust deficit. But how does Germany earn respect? Will we see a stronger Germany that we all want to see?
Well, I think you have seen the recent speeches by President Gauck and the Foreign Minister Steinmeier. That's a clear indication that the German political leadership wants to achieve a change of direction. So a repetition of Libya, I think, is not very much likely. And in Libya, I should say, from my perspective, the mistake was not so much not to participate, but to abstain in the vote in the United Nations Security Council. That we should not have done, then to side with Russia, China, India, Brazil, what have you. That is not the company Germany should look for. And to leave our old allies to whom we owe everything. German unification would have been impossible without the support of the United States of America. They alone made it possible, not the other ones. That should not be forgotten. And gratitude is something which matters in politics, since emotions matter. It's personalities and emotions which matter in politics, not so much the concepts. The concepts are not understood by Joe Sixpack. He wants to see pictures which remain ingrained in his memory. And in that respect, we have done a little bit too little in the past few years. And that is, I think, is something which both sides have to take into account. I'm not worried about Germany not living up to its responsibility. I think we will do it. It will be a difficult process. It will be a process which will take time. And you, our American friends, should not forget what I discussed so often with my dear colleague Colin Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was in the days of the first Iraq war. And he told me one time and again, come on, one German tank division, go with us. And I told him, well, Colin, you should not forget, you have taught us for some 40 years. You Germans stand upright, but underneath the carpet. And suddenly you ask us to be on the carpet and to be 6 feet tall. That is impossible. And I reminded him of the situation of the American Civil War and how long it took the United States of America to act outside their own country after the Civil War. It was, in my recollection, some 30 years or more.
Yeah.
And you cannot expect that a nation which depends on the public vote in a democracy, in a nation which was divided for 40 years, and this division was extremely deep, much deeper than we all anticipated, that it can stand united overnight. And I think that is something which our American allies need to understand. We are still in this process. We are not yet a united nation. We are in the process of growing together.
So, if President Gauck and Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier are arguing for a more, in the most positive sense of the word, assertive, aggressive, involved, leading Germany, and Americans have wanted that for a long time, does the most powerful politician in Europe agree with them, Angela Merkel? Is she in favor of this?
I'll answer that. So we are witnessing, so I actually wrote this down, we are witnessing a structural change, right? Because in the last administration, the last Merkel administration, we saw the driver of foreign policy move very clearly away from the foreign ministry, away from the foreign minister, back into the chancellery. And that was coined this idea of the culture of restraint. And suddenly, and you will see, I guarantee you, heated domestic debates about this, and you're already seeing it within the parties, because you are suddenly seeing other people driving this process. You are seeing the Minister of Defense and the Foreign Minister driving this process, and we had press reports this week about the Defense Minister's party wanting to rein her in because they're not entirely on par with her activism. So we are going to see a number of structural debates in terms of who really wears the pants, quote unquote, in this new German foreign policy potentially. So I think there is some working out that we still need to do. I wanted to make one point on the difference of attention span. The Europeans don't have enough empathy for what it means to be the American president. If you look at the map of the United States, if you put the United States at the center of your world map, the fact that the Pacific and the geopolitical challenges that are arising for the United States in Asia Pacific are fundamentally real and just as much important as the things that are going on the other side of the Atlantic. I think the Europeans don't have sufficient empathy for that or sympathy for that or understand just how deeply stacked the American foreign policy agenda, what Professor Burns refers to as his foreign policy inbox, really is. And I do think that conversely, if the Europeans are making demands, they also have to look at that and there's sort of resurgence of classic IR. I do think that we're going to have a very public debate, and the German president made this very clear in his speech, that this is a debate that doesn't only have to go on in the German Bundestag, it is a debate that has to go on on German marketplaces, because Mr. Bütikofer pointed this out, there is a huge gap, much as there is here in this country, about where military intervention should go, whether there should be military intervention. The German public is not entirely on board with the kind of strategy that's been put out. So you're going to have some debate on what it means, what responsibility means, because there's alliance responsibility, there's moral responsibility, there's political responsibility, and those debates are going to be, you have to have them out, because the German army is, first and foremost, a parliamentary army. And that is what the Americans are going to have patience with the German side, because that is how these agendas get set. And it takes time, and these debates have to happen. They have to happen at the security conference publicly. They have to happen in the 250 bilateral meetings that happened at the Munich Security Conference, but they also have to happen on German marketplaces. And without it, you're never going to be able to put together the kind of integrated strategy that involves diplomacy, defense, development that we need in Germany.
Thank you, Catherine. I think we have time for 2 more questions, and I want to just pivot from what Catherine said, Reinhard, to you and Wolfgang, because you live in the capital of Europe, the so-called capital of Europe, at least part of the time, when you're in the European Parliament in Bruxelles. And some people would say that, well, Henry Kissinger said 41 years ago, he didn't know who to call. There was no one phone number. Victoria Nuland said, well, I can't repeat what Victoria Nuland said, because Harvard University is a civilized place, we don't use such language. But they both made quite aggressive statements about Europe. If Europe cannot, in Brussels, have a central figure with whom the United States and China can work, doesn't that figure have to be the German chancellor? Given the weight of Germany, seriously, in Europe and in global politics, shouldn't Germany assume the role, in a way, of the leading voice in Europe?
Let me start with a remark on this now famous comment by Victoria Nuland on Twitter. When I circulated the tweet, I got quite a few answers saying, well, what she said, that's common knowledge in Europe. Many of us think quite the same. So I don't think that you should get the impression that we're all sort of deeply angry about the remark. We know how to take that. And regarding this telephone number, you told a joke earlier about the Pope, so let me tell my joke here, and this goes like this. After the Lisbon Treaty, there now is a telephone number, so if you call, you get an answering machine, and it says, for the German answer, dial 1, for the French answer, dial 2, and so on. So we made progress, but there are still different answers. And I don't think that it's a solution to say, talk to the Chancellor. I remember a conversation with Mr. Mullaney from the USTR's office about TTIP when he said, well, Germany will have to deliver France. Forgive me, that's not going to happen. I mean, the US have to talk to a couple of people, not just the Germans. Of course, the Germans play a role, but others are also still important. And on the security issues, France is particularly important. And for the internal dynamic of the European Union, I think it's great that there is something for France to balance the overpowering strength of Germany in economic issues, because without sort of finding some kind of new balance within the EU, we're not going to move forward. And you should not expect something that could be compared to a Damascus moment. You went there as Saul and you returned as Paul. That's not going to happen. Germany will have to take initiatives to be stronger, but within the EU, as Wolfgang Ischinger explained in his presentation. And Mrs. Merkel obviously was part of the Kultur der Zurückhaltung. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been an abstention in the UNSC. But now I also figure she could have stopped some of the remarks. She could have made her ministers sort of take a more cautious attitude in Munich. So you should assume that she is considering, I would say she is at her best, yet undecided. And for a leader, that's not necessarily a bad quality to decide at a later moment. If you don't know exactly where to go, to be willing to avoid dead ends is a very good leadership quality. So you will not have to expect another Libya moment. I think that's over. And you will not have to expect a higher defense budget. Because obviously, as Secretary Hagel said, it's not about raw numbers. It's about effectiveness. If you go and promote pooling and sharing as the Swedish-German initiative proposed in 2011, you can have a lot more bang for the buck or bullet for the buck or whatever. You can have much more capabilities without overspending. So there is some interesting opportunities, and Munich signals that Germany is now trying to make use of them.
Okay. Wolfgang, did you have a view on this question of the Chancellor and where she stands in her own worldview about Germany's role in the world?
Well, I think, I think it's been one of her trademarks that she has, in her foreign policy decision-making, been extremely careful not to be seen as a risk taker. I don't think that will change. She has been very successful politically. She has the trust and the support of the citizens for this policy of rather staying behind, not leading from behind, staying behind. So I wouldn't expect her now to jump to the front. I think she will wait to see how this plays out. It's interesting for me to see that within 2 weeks, before Munich and after Munich, the popularity of Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who is exactly the person who proposed, below the level of the federal president, this more outspoken or more forward-leaning foreign policy, the popularity has risen dramatically. Now, what exactly does that mean and how should it be interpreted? I wouldn't go too far, but I think this is a promising sign. And if this continues to be the case, then I'm sure Chancellor Merkel will support her foreign minister in this kind of activity. But I don't think she will want to carry the flag herself.
Thank you. Final comment on this line
I think
from Klaus.
Foreign Minister Steinmeier understood, based on his previous experience, one point in international organizations. You can only shape the direction and determine the direction of an international organization if you make an offer. If you are driven by the international organization, you pay a high price, but you do not get anything for it. And that lesson, I think, is the one which the Chancellor still needs to understand. Steinmeier, I think, is leading the right way, and we will see how she will react to it. But I agree with Wolfgang, she's extremely cautious.
Thank you. We want to go to questions from the audience. And Marco, I'm going to ask for extra time, if you don't mind. But I want to ask the most important question that I can think of is concerning Brazil and Deutschland. And I am a longtime supporter of Deutschland. When the United States, and it's always when, not if, loses in the World Cup, I transfer my allegiance to Deutschland. So I'd like each of you, and we're going to put you on the record, will Deutschland win the World Cup in Brazil this spring, summer? Reinhard, we're going to start with you. You're on the record.
I have a habit of betting against what I hope for. So I would say Germany will end up third.
Okay, and Wolfgang, if Germany's third, who's going to be first and second?
No, Germany's going to win, of course.
Look, I have this bifurcated allegiance, but I sort of feel, and I have the best boss at the Harvard Kennedy School because he allows me to take long lunch breaks for important tournaments to go and watch them. So that I should say that. I'm sadly more on the outside line, though of course the hope stays alive. I don't think we're going to make it to the very, very top. We've got a lot of structural issues right now. We've got a lot of injured players. So we'll see how the coach turns around, but certainly top 3.
And Catherine, you're a German and American citizen. When the United States plays Germany, who do you root for?
Well, I would say always for the underdog, but in football, my
United States.
heart bleeds with my red passport, so.
Good answer. Klaus.
Well, having played handball actively for some 20 years, I have to say I never entered a match without the firm intention to win. And I've always thought that most of the most stupid remarks in sport was Pierre de Coubertin, who said participation is important, not victory. For me, the only thing which matters in sport is victory, so I hope that Germany will win.
You are a Vince Lombardi disciple?
Exactly. Said the exchange student from Kenosha, Wisconsin. Thank you. Okay, we have time for questions for our panelists. We have microphones. Please, who would like to ask the first? And just please give us your name, and we'll go here first. Then we'll go to you. Right? Yes.
My name is Sven Bartels from Germany. I've got the question with our special German history. I'm pretty sure that once Germany will take some kind of a leader role, as we were talking about, that there will be concerns from other European countries, but as well, other countries about Germany taking the role with our special history. How should Germany react about that, and what should America do about that?
Who would like to? Klaus.
Well, I think I can answer this question based on practical experience. When I was chairman, when I was first serving in the military committee as Chief of Defense Staff Germany, I never sensed any objection to Germany shaping the direction of the NATO military committee. We quite often.
Which you chaired.
Huh?
You chaired the committee.
Yeah, later on I chaired, but first as Chief of Defense Staff, I really often told my colleagues from the smaller NATO countries that should be the approach we should take. We coordinated our views, and quite occasionally I ran into difficulties with my American colleague at the time, Colin Powell, who said, well, we would like to take it in this and this direction. And I said to him, Colin, that's fine, but you have 1 vote, we have 8 votes, since we coordinated our view. Should we settle for a compromise? And no one objected to Germany taking a leading role. And I think if we do it in a balanced way, take into account the views of the smaller nations, and coordinate our approach with the nations which matter, the United States, Britain, France, increasingly Poland, then I think we would not have to fear any objections on the side of our European or international partners.
I would just say, since you asked about the U.S., I anticipate no objections from the United States. In fact, what the United States Republican and Democratic administrations have long looked for is a stronger Germany. I'll give you the example. When I was ambassador to NATO, I served with a brilliant German diplomat named Gebhard von Moltke. And he was a real leader in the council, then 19 ambassadors inside the room. And everyone followed him and listened to him because of his wisdom, not because of the name of the country. No one felt that way. So I think in NATO, you're going to see a real strong desire for this German leadership.
Could I just offer a footnote to this? Nick, you and I used to be involved when we were both active in our respective foreign ministries in what used to be called, in the good old days of the Cold War, die Vierergruppe, you know, the United States, France, the UK, and Germany. It was an informal arrangement which helped in many, many cases in the alliance to sort of determine the way forward. It was not a diktat by the big ones sort of ignoring the small ones. Absolutely not. I really felt bad when I saw last year I believe it must have been in July or August, on television news, when I saw pictures of a meeting on Syria in the Elysee, hosted by President Hollande, with John Kerry, the British Foreign Secretary, and of course the French Foreign Minister, and the country that was absent from the scene was Germany. That is not the way it ought to be. We should be part of that group. That's what I mean by leadership, co-leadership, not dictating to the smaller European countries what should happen, but trying to be part of those who have the capacity of thinking beyond, the narrow confines of your own small neighborhood. Many Americans, maybe don't fully understand that the vast majority of member countries of the European Union are very tiny countries with populations of 10 million or less, and only a handful, including, of course, Italy, Poland, Spain, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, are big countries with significant industries, with significant arms production capabilities when we talk about how to improve our defense capability, et cetera, et cetera. And those are the countries that need to assume this kind of leadership role in an informal way. Again, not by dictating to the smaller ones. The decisions need to be taken in Brussels by all 28. And last word, I think the German experience has been that we have always been successful in helping to conduct EU business when we behaved in a way that allowed us to have the smaller ones, the Dutch, the Luxembourg, our tiny neighbors on our side as our partners and supporters. That's been a very successful recipe, exercised for many years. And there's no reason why we should abandon that.
Helmut Kohl was famous for listening to the small member countries before he made proposals or presented Franco-German solutions. That has been, lagging. I remember talking to people in the Chancellor's office who made very harsh remarks about a majority of the members of the European Council coming to the Council meeting without knowing or understanding the issues. If that's your attitude, you can't lead. So I think we should learn from what has just been pointed out. But then there's a lot of goodwill. Just remember the Polish Minister Sikorski saying, we want Germany rather to lead than to hide from its responsibilities.
Catherine.
I have literally a half sentence on this, and it is a direct quote of the last sentence of President Gauck's speech at the Munich Security Conference that made me, as a young half-German, exceptionally proud, because he said, we should not trust in ourselves because we are the German nation, but because we are this German nation. And the point of the this is the summary of all these points that were made just here, because since the end of the Second World War, we have had all of these experiences. And European integration would have been nothing without the famous, we say in German, Männerfreundschaft between Helmut Schmidt and Giscard d'Estaing, because their close coordination in terms of who goes first, symbolically and politically, built a modern European Union. And we have these examples 3 or 4 times over. So this German nation can absolutely fulfill the tasks that are asked of it.
Yes, sir.
I'm Herbert Quelle, a German diplomat currently enjoying a sabbatical here at Harvard. First, my observation, I fully agree with what Ambassador Ischinger said about the special situation that we face. It's not a policy issue that we're talking about. I believe that after the Pearl Harbor of this millennium, which happened on the day that Wolfgang Ischinger took over his job in Washington, since then the United States has sort of been drifting away from part of its heritage, which is the personal freedom element in its heritage. And I think that lies at the root of the problem we are facing. So in a way, I'm a little surprised that we heard Julian Smith, and I couldn't ask her this question, but it may go in a way to the only American on the podium, that she's still talking in the old sort of adage about bringing democracy and human rights to the world, with this sort of missionary statement, seemingly not realizing that exactly that has become very difficult, because trust in the moral high ground of the United States has been shattered to a large extent by what we have seen. And I think, so apart from the bilateral relationship that we're talking about, it has become very difficult for the United States and for the West as a whole to stand in for the values, for the value system, as we could before much easier. And then the final comment, just, I find it very strange that we still use the Iraq War and Chancellor Schröder's policy on that as sort of blemish on the German foreign policy issue, although it seems to be common wisdom in the United States, even among conservative circles, that this war was a bad mistake. So we should strike it from the elements in summarizing what went wrong at a certain time. I don't agree with that, at least. Thank you.
Thank you. Was that just a series of comments, or do you want someone here to...
The question is, do you think... The question was actually, do you, as the only American, believe that the democratization and human rights moral mission of the United States can still be pursued as it could be pursued before what we learned about certain practices in the United States?
The answer to your question is absolutely yes. Without a doubt, yes. I would say, just as a citizen, that as President Obama has said, what the Snowden affair has meant for us on this side of the Atlantic is that we have to jealously protect our civil liberties, and that there is a proper debate that is underway right now about the extent of government powers and the need for us to defend our own Constitution and to protect civil liberties. So I think that debate is on in the United States. We never claim to be perfect, and no country is, but would I then say, based on the revelations of Snowden, and by the way, I think Snowden has engendered the debate, but I think many people, well, I would certainly say that what he did was absolutely immoral in breaking his oath that he took. He's done enormous damage to our country. And so I don't consider him a hero in any way, shape, or form. But if I recognize my own country's blemishes and imperfections and serious flaws, I certainly still think in the real world in which we all live, the United States and NATO, Germany and the United States represent the highest form of democracy in the world today, and I think we do have an obligation to support human rights and democracy with some self-confidence around the world. And as we look east, with all due respect to China, and we must live in peace with China, I don't want to live in a world that's dominated by China. I'd much rather live in a world where the United States remains the predominant military power and political power. And that's what we are in NATO with you. And so I don't want us to drift apart, and I understand that my government needs to repair the rift with the Chancellor personally and with the German people. I mean, we've all listened, and I think Most Americans get it. But we don't believe that our condition is fallen in the theological sense and that we can't stand up and be proud of our own country, because we are.
Just, can I add one comment to this? You asked earlier, Nick, you know, about the two-way street. Is this only American failure, or what kind of mistakes may have been made on the other side? Well, I believe we are tempted, we the Germans, we are tempted to regard this Snowden or NSA affair as to misinterpret it as a bilateral German-American problem, which it isn't, of course. And I think that goes to the core of the kind of debate we've had in Germany. I was horrified, quite frankly, when some of my friends in the German government publicly said, let's now go to Washington and negotiate a bilateral no-spy agreement. I mean, quite frankly, I thought that was a pretty foolish idea, because was Germany going to negotiate on behalf of the rest of the world? The argument, I think, that needs to be explained back home in Berlin is that even if tomorrow morning President Obama signed an executive order, you know, eliminating the NSA in its totality, the problem wouldn't go away. We would still have plenty of spying and eavesdropping in the world. So it's absolutely not a German-American problem. But what we have is a German-American trust problem, right? But the intelligence and Snowden and NSA problem, of course, is a global issue, and it needs to be dealt with not only in our bilateral relationship. I think that's part of a kind of a debate that we need to have, and we need to educate ourselves that even if we made up and found a way to deal with these issues bilaterally, the problem, the underlying problem of a fundamentally new world created out of on the basis of these new technologies, that wouldn't be resolved and can't be resolved in a bilateral manner, at least not in my view.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Martin. I'm also a German. The panel seems to agree that more activist German foreign policy, more German leadership would be highly desirable. My question is, what concrete core national interests do we have that are not currently being achieved? And how would such a foreign policy, or simply more leadership, whatever that may involve, actually help us meet them? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to? Reinhard.
Well, President Gauck in his speech tried to identify a core German interest in preserving a relatively liberal, as far as it goes, democratic, free, peaceful global order. I agree with that. And can we, just for a second, believe that this has been cemented so deeply and strongly that we can give up on working on it? Obviously not. So I would say this is something that takes much more effort, and there are adversarial forces that put that into question that are gaining strength internationally. Now, some of those adversarial forces may have arisen out of problems that we created by applying not so good policies in the past, but that doesn't change reality. Even if we're responsible to some degree for the problems that we're now faced with, they're still there. and we still have this core interest. And I would add that we have a core interest that goes beyond that. We don't just have a conservative interest in keeping the international order as is. We have an interest in developing the international order, because we have to find a way of making some of these newly arising or asserting powers responsible stakeholders, and that's not a given. We have to deal with new issues like runaway climate change, with issues like mass migration, all kinds of issues that have serious security aspects, serious economic aspects, serious human rights aspects, and so on and so on. And by no means can we rely on a automatic stability of the international order. So we have to actively work for that. And these interests are not German interests as opposed to French interests or Portuguese interests or Polish interests. They align.
Are we, just to build on that question, it's a great question. Are we looking at this is highly simplistic to put it this way, but it's illustrative, a less pacifist Germany? A Germany with a greater willingness and capacity to be with the French, for instance, in Mali and the Central African Republic?
Well, I would like to remind all of us to the obligation which we took in the moment of unification, when the federal president said, under the applause of all Germans, the united Germany will make its best possible contribution to the promotion of freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. That is our international obligation which we took. And if we mean that serious, then we have to be prepared to share risks and burdens with our partners who pursue exactly the same objectives. And as far as this really utterly rubbish of militarization of German foreign policy is concerned, I would like to remind you, all of you, that we are possibly the only country in the world in which the Constitution does not allow the participation in the preparation or the conduct of any war of aggression. So there is never a risk of a militarization. We will always pursue the use of military, which one should not rule out as the last resort, which does not necessarily mean the last in terms of time, that we will always pursue this under the rules of democracy and under the rule of law.
I think that question was very symbolic for, I think, the misunderstanding among the German public in terms of what German national interest is. Because we had a famous chancellor who said, look, if you have visions, you need to see a doctor. And so the point is that it hasn't been mapped out for the German public. And this is what I meant earlier in terms of, the devil is in the details. So we're not sending fighting troops to Mali and the Central African Republic. We're sending specialist troops, we're sending ambulance ships, we're sending all sorts of specialized, highly specialized forces. That has everything to do with Germany's moral obligation. I'll make one quick comment or statement and then just sort of conclude. The piece that I wanted to underline is the chairwoman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the People's Republic of China, Chairwoman Fu Ying, said in a sadly very sparsely attended forum at the Munich Security Conference, looking predominantly at the Arab Spring, but to say, well, the verdict is still out on whether democracy is the right model and if communism is not the way to success. Now, as long as those statements are still floated, I think the Western project very much clearly has a raison d'etre and has something that very strongly must continue for the future and must continue being shaped, including by countries like Germany. And that means that you have to explain to the German people what constitutes German national interest, and that those components are going to be met by an integrated, inclusive, national German strategy that includes development, diplomacy, and potentially military force in and as it is needed.
Wolfgang, did you want to add to this?
One brief point. The German government, the last one, and I would imagine also the current one, has repeatedly expressed its satisfaction, its pride in the fact that when under the German constitution, the German government goes to the parliament, goes to the Bundestag, requesting a decision to deploy military force. We have never had, that is what the government correctly claims, we've never had a single case where that permission was not granted. Now, I happen to disagree with my own government on this point. I believe it should not be seen as a source of pride and satisfaction. It is actually an expression of the extreme, risk averseness of the German government. I applaud David Cameron for going to the British Parliament and actually losing once. I believe it is healthy for a country to have a debate, as you did. I mean, as a reader of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, even from my place in Berlin, I thought I could tell pretty in some detail who was in the White House in favor, who was not in favor, what the people at the Pentagon were thinking, and the senators on what to do and what not to do about Syria. France had made a decision to be prepared to go forward. The only country that decided that it should not have a debate were we. We didn't allow our parliament to have a debate whether we should or should not do something. Now, you might argue that has to do with the fact that we were in an election campaign, but I'm afraid that even if there had not been an election campaign, we would not have had a real, controversial debate with some folks arguing, yes, we should, and maybe some other folks arguing, absolutely not. I think that's what I would hope would come out of this debate, that we would, be strong enough and courageous enough to allow ourselves to have these kind of open debates where the outcome and the eventual voting result in the Bundestag may not be, a forsaken conclusion before you even start the debate. I think that would be a good step forward.
I fully agree with Wolfgang on that. As a former military, I should say it is a strength if the parliament decides on the deployment of armed forces. Then the armed forces know they are deployed on behalf of the German people. Yeah. And I would go even one step further. I think we should perhaps think about the model of the United States of America to discuss at the beginning of every parliamentary period, a national security strategy. Yeah. And every year, from my perspective, the German parliament should discuss what progress was achieved on the implementation of this strategy. This would mean that the people would get involved in discussion of security policy.
We do that in the European Parliament, and we're making progress through those discussions.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. And when this question is asked, I want to invite the four panelists just to answer the question if they'd like, or say whatever they'd like to say to conclude, because then we'll have to conclude the proceedings. And thank you for the extra time. We appreciate that very, very much. A final question. We don't mean to call on all men, but we haven't had any. Yes, we do, in the back. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Irene Sun. I am a joint degree student between the Kennedy School and the Business School. And I'm not German. Sorry. I'm actually Chinese, and so my question actually concerns Germany's stance as far as politics and security regarding East Asia. My question is what sort of role you think Germany will play in leading what I think will be the world's pivot towards the East, both in terms of economic and also political and soft power. And if I can editorialize for a second, when I hear things like, I don't understand how anybody, it's a danger to the world when somebody says it's not certain that democracy is the right form of government, and that's a danger to the world, it makes it hard for me to think how, Germany and a country like China, which now is Germany's, third largest trading partner, could be truly building a relationship based on trust. And so, it would be great to hear your views as to how this will evolve. Thank you.
Irene, thank you for the question. It's a good question. Shouldn't this pivot be a European-American pivot? Shouldn't we all be focused on bigger relations with China? Maybe we'll just take it. Reinhard will go for you, then to Wolfgang, and then to Catherine and Klaus.
Well, I think it was a year ago that it was at the end of the first Obama administration that Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, got so fed up with all the European nagging about the pivot that she finally told us, well, why don't you pivot and to Asia also? And instead of just admonishing us, she went extra miles trying to take the Europeans on board. So here in Washington and in Brussels, a lot of conversations went on, and finally at on the fringe of a Southeast Asian regional meeting, Clinton and Lady Ashton published a common statement on US-EU policy towards Asia. It was reported in the Chinese media. It was reported in one US media, I think. It was not at all reported in Europe. So at that time, the openness towards Asia was not there. That is changing fast. As far as I can tell from Brussels, it clearly is changing fast, and there is, I wouldn't call it a pivot or a rebalancing, but there is more attention towards Asian partners. And I would not want Germany to play its own fiddle in that context. I would want Germany to team up with the rest of the European Union and have a united Asia strategy.
Well, I can be very brief. I agree with this. Germans have tended to believe in the past that our strategy in Asia is to sell as many BMWs as we possibly can. That's good, but that's not good enough. And Germans need to hear from their leaders that because of the intensity of the relationship in terms of mutual dependencies in trade and also growing in investment between Europe and China, and particularly between Germany and China, we need to take an active interest in stability and security in East Asia. If there were, God forbid, an escalating conflict between China and Japan, the lights would go out in the BMW factory in Munich. And we would find out that our interests, strategic, political, and business, would be hurt in a most dramatic way. So, in other words, we have to be on a learning curve here and accept the fact that our own future depends to an increasing part on the kinds, hopefully also on the kinds of contributions that we as Europeans can make, modest contributions, certainly not by sending aircraft carriers into the Taiwanese waters. That's not the idea. But I believe that our ambassadors should have clear instructions, including the ambassador of the European Union in Beijing or in Japan, to explain a clear position of the European Union, what we think about the islands. We can't leave that responsibility only to our big brother, the United States. So, and of course, what I'm saying here is that we should have a view, we should express it, and we should closely coordinate it with Washington.
I mean, this is preaching to the choir, but unfortunately, the EU ambassador to Beijing is now back in Berlin, helping the new foreign minister. So that'll have to be the next guy or woman. Yes, so it's absolutely right. We've had a Germany has had a geo-economic policy. It's been completely bifurcated between the Chinese human rights record. I mean, this is what gets reported in the German press. Chinese human rights record, why didn't the chancellor say enough? And sort of all the bosses of captains of industry she brought with her on her various trips to China. So I think, again, we have to see this from a more integrated, it has to be a geostrategic approach. All these integrated problems, you have some of the world's largest cities in China. The problems that arise from density, pandemics, migration, movement, all those things are real. They're real across the globe. It is about defining toward China and pulling China into a global discussion. We talked about the need for a changing institutional framework around the globe. We have to, again, not repeat some of the mistakes that we have made now in this transatlantic partnership most recently. We have to be engaging China in a productive way. So we have to be able to say, look, we have something to offer. Some of these solutions that you're struggling with, we have worked out, without sort of showing up, transatlantically, hand in hand, saying, look, what we're pushing for is regime change. That's never, ever going to function. So it has to be a very practical, but a much more geostrategic, geopolitical, integrated strategy between both sides of the Atlantic toward the Pacific.
Well, being a global trading nation like Germany, we have a keen interest in promoting peace and stability in Asia. And I agree quite with Wolfgang Ischinger when he said we should express our views on disputes in a clear-cut way, always aiming at a peaceful resolution of the conflicts. And just to add one last remark, the late Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai was said to have stated that it is 200 years after the French Revolution by far too early to judge whether they got it right or wrong. As a European who has suffered from the mistakes which were made 100 years ago, I think it is not too early to avoid the mistakes which were made 100 years ago and which led to the biggest catastrophe Europe has seen in the past 100 years. So sometimes it's not bad to learn from history.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank everyone here for attending today and for attending this session and listening to our panelists. I wanted to say a word of thanks to the German students at the Kennedy School. They are a very important part of our school. The McCloy Scholars and the other German students, they put the conference on every year. It's a very valuable conference, particularly for Americans, to really get a sense of what Germans are thinking and to hear the passion that you heard in this panel about the trust deficit, which was my big takeaway as an American, that we need to work, we Americans, to close that deficit. So to Mirko and all of his colleagues, thank you to the German students. Thank you for being part of Harvard. And to Reinhard and Wolfgang and Catherine and Klaus, thanks for such interesting conversation. Good evening.